And I have the pleasure, this is for the live streaming, that's what this, so I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sven Larsson, who isn't just grouching about the economy. He has some practical ways, or at least fundamental ways, to get government to shrink and freedom to grow. The basic thing that Sven taught me is that you can't force consumption. That as soon as there's an element of force in it, it doesn't work. So that gives us a lot of room to get rid of government programs. So Dr. Larsson is Swedish. His PhD is from Denmark, and he has a long experience with public policy in the United States. So please help me welcome Dr. Larsson.
Thank you. I'm going to use a PowerPoint today. We'll see how that turns out. It's warming up. And I've been told I have to stand over here for all the live streaming and everything. I'm not going to do that right now because I want to make sure this thing works. But what I wanted to say first is that what I'm going to talk about tonight is absolutely nothing complicated, nothing fancy. It's very, very common sense. And the reason why I want to do that is that we are so very often so stuck in conventional mindsets that anything that has to do with changing big things when it comes to political issues has to be difficult, has to be complicated. I want to get away from that. So I think this thing is working, so I'm going to simply take my spot over here. Essentially, what I want to call this is the Economic Freedom Toolkit. 4 practical, very common sense steps for how to do away with government programs, how to permanently reduce government, or, as I prefer to call it, make freedom big and government small. The key to doing this, not surprisingly, is to have a private sector that grows. Private sector growth is what we need in Wyoming. We need that everywhere, especially here in Wyoming. And what does that mean more specifically? Well, first of all, obviously it's necessary for freedom and prosperity. The private sector is what produces value in our economy. Government never does that. For those of you who've studied economics, you know that there are ways to measure government production value. Technically, when you do national accounts, you add up government value, what it adds to the economy, but that is based on coerced revenue and is never based on market values, which means that effectively it doesn't add anything, it only redistributes, and there is a great deal of loss in between. But we have a little bit of a problem with private sector growth here in Wyoming. In 2010, we were dead last of all the 50 states. Our private sector grew more slowly than in any other of the 50 states. I think it'd be even worse if you include Canada, because back in 2010 the Canadian economy was doing pretty well. 2011, same thing. We had actually a shrinking private sector and we were doing worse than the rest of the country. 2012, we were in the last spot together with Connecticut. We actually managed to crawl up to their level, which I wouldn't say is exactly an accomplishment. But if we look a little more in detail, we see that our private sector is not just in general doing poorly. One of the less spoken of facts is that our minerals industry is not doing very well. What am I saying here? Well, if you look over the last 16 months of Bureau of Labor Statistics employment numbers, you will see that in the minerals sector, each month has had, over the last 16 months, they've had fewer employees than the same month a year earlier. So if you go back 16 months back in time, start November last year, you will see that if you compare that employment number to a year earlier in the minerals industry, they had fewer employees. That tells us that the minerals industry is in pretty darn bad shape. The minerals industry has been considered the backbone of the Wyoming economy. If you look at what's happened over the past year, yes, the private sector has had a worse job creation track than in other states, in most other states. But if you look at what happened in the middle of the crisis, September 2011, there were actually more people working in the private sector in Wyoming than in September 2013. Since then, we've had a little bit of a change. October and November, you can see a little bit of an increase, with the exceptions of exception of the minerals industry. So the rest of the private sector has been doing a little bit better. But this is not a trend, a new trend. This is maybe a halt of a negative trend. We will see where it goes when we get the final numbers. But the bottom line is the Wyoming economy is weak, and we have to do something about this. And I'm going to be so audacious as to say that government is the problem. We have a too big a government. If anybody wants to question that, I'll be happy to discuss it, but I'm going to take that as a premise. And there is one compelling way to show how big government is, that in terms of how it occupies place in the economy. And that is if we look at something called the government employment ratio, or the number of state and local government employees per 1,000 private employees. And if we look at these numbers from November 2013, here's what we get. In Rhode Island, there were 122 state and local bureaucrats per 1,000 private employees. In the U.S. As a whole, the number was 173. Then we go up to the 4 states with the biggest bureaucracies. Mississippi, 251. New Mexico, 268. Alaska, 292. They've actually passed New Mexico now. And who is at the top? Wyoming. 317 state and local employees per 1,000 private employees. We have the biggest government bureaucracy in the country. I'm not counting federal employees here. Why? Because they are not under the jurisdiction of the state. But if you add that, we're still at the top. We're still very high, it doesn't change very much the order of the biggest states here. It shuffles them around a little bit. But the point of looking at state and local employees is that that's what we can regulate. We can control that. We have the power to do something about this number. We can do it 2 ways. We can shrink bureaucracies, and we can encourage growth in the private sector. Okay, government. The point here is to shrink government. That's what we have to do in order to give more room to the private sector. And again, that was the question we were supposed to address tonight. How do we do this? What does it mean to shrink government? Well, a lot of people say, just cut spending, damn it. Just slash the budget across the board like this. That seems compelling, that seems attractive somehow, but it won't work. And I'll tell you why. The spending programs are what drive government spending over time. How they are configured. The spending programs are the conveyors of government promises. So long as government still makes promises to us, they will maintain their spending programs. They will continue to spend money according to the formulas embedded in these programs. As long as government still makes promises, they will continue to spend. So if we have government growing over time, we make a one-time cut in spending, it's going to grow back. Just like that bush in your backyard. So the key here, obviously, is to end government promises. To remove the government promises, to stop making promises by means of legislation and taxation and spending. So the first step toward ending government promises is to terminate the entitlement programs. It's to stop saying, we as a people have to stop saying through our elected officials that we're going to give certain people certain entitlements and then over time grow that. Now, what does this mean? Well, one example is, I'm going to go out on a limb here and talk about something. I know this is a little provocative. This is something that can be a little contentious. But I'm going to suggest an end to public education as an example. This is Amy Edmonds' area, so I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm going to give you a very, very brief common sense approach to how do you structure your thinking around terminating entitlement programs and taking the other steps, ending the government promises here. How do you do that? Well, for example, if we terminate the entitlement programs here, it means no more public schools, obviously. That's so common sense, I think kids who haven't even started school yet can understand that. It means the government sells or closes its K through 12 schools. That's what it means in practice. So let's continue to shrink government. Let's continue to work on ending government promises. The next step we have to take means that we terminate the taxes that pay for entitlements. A lot of times when we focus on shrinking government, reforming away some government spending, the thinking kind of stops at just terminating the spending program. But we have to realize that so long as government is taxing to pay for that program, if we terminate the program, they're still going to occupy our income. And that means that it's a lot harder, if not impossible, for many people to be able to replace government when it comes to buying private education. So we have to terminate the taxes that pay for entitlements. What would that mean in this case? Well, for example, tax cuts targeted at households with children, say property taxes, could be an example. That's not a perfect solution, but it's an example of how to start. But there are families who rent, who don't directly pay property taxes. If you cut property taxes, they're not going to get a share of that. There are people who own homes that are not valued very highly, and therefore they don't pay a lot of property taxes. So their cost for their education could be higher than what they would get if you cut or eliminate property taxes. So we may need a system of vouchers as a transition, or the long-term solution, if we terminate the taxes that pay for public education, together with terminating public education itself, would be private charitable vouchers for poor families, as an example of how we can replace government funding. We can have a system where we encourage donations with especially strong, perhaps especially generous tax cuts. I'm just giving you an example. To foundations, to charitable organizations that give out vouchers to poor families so they can send their kids to good private schools. But this is not all. There is more. We have to shrink government even more. How do we do that? Well, the third step is to remove all related regulations. Let's not forget that government is present in our lives through spending, taxation and fees, and regulations. And in terms of ending regulations related to schools, this means, for example, no federal or state curriculum. And this is an issue that, again, Amy Edmonds is working very thoroughly on. I'm not going to delve into it, but I want to make one point. The more comprehensive government regulations are of curricula, the more expensive it gets to actually produce education. And that means that the cost goes up, and that prices people out of the private education market. No more school building mandates, for example. This is another regulation that we can get away from. We don't have to build shrines to public education. I know I've discussed this issue before with Taylor Haynes, and he has pointed out that why can't we have a one classroom school building in our neighborhood? So these are two examples of how you can vastly cut the cost of producing education without necessarily causing any quality glitches. On the contrary, you encourage innovation, focusing on the kids and the quality of education. Take away the ancillary costs, if you will. And if we go about it this way with these 3 steps, we've come a long way. But we have to do one more thing, to shrink government really to really small size. Complete private sector replacement of government. Essentially, this is a summary of what I just talked about. But we have to, this is more of us conquering the concepts and the reasoning and learning how to put together a thought process that we can use when we talk to our elected officials or when we run for office ourselves. To be able to actually present the whole picture of what it means to reform away government. In this case, it means getting government out of funding, taxes, operating school buildings and teachers, regulating curricula, school buildings again, lunch mandates, and overseeing education. Let's not forget that government sometimes believes that it has a role in overseeing private markets, just to make sure everything works the way it's supposed to according to what politicians believe is the right way to do things. It means getting government out of all parts of the education market, everywhere. Now, in what order do we do these 4 steps? Well, obviously, they all have to come together. The tricky part is not putting together these 4 steps and formulating the strategy. The tricky part is how do you do this in a legislative process. That's tougher. It can be done. It absolutely can be done. But in order to be able to formulate an intelligent legislative strategy, we first have to know where we're going, why, and how. Let me summarize this by pointing to the conditions for success. And again, this doesn't just apply to education. This applies to almost every government program. The first condition for success is obviously we can't do reforms that just replaces government with a private monopoly. There are valid critics of free market reforms that point to the fact that you may have one big company sitting there ready to buy up every hospital that government would privatize or become the only provider of quality education in a rural area. We can avoid that, but we have to be aware of the risk and make sure that the reforms, for example, take place when you have a sufficient supply of entrepreneurs ready to step in with a realistic chance of becoming a player on the market. The next part, of course, is that consumers must have purchasing power. We cannot have a market, and this goes back to what I said about taxes. We cannot do free market reforms if government doesn't cut taxes in proportion to the reform to return money to consumers, to taxpayers' pockets. We have to have a maximum impact of tax cuts so that people feel that they actually have the money to go out and be consumers, to shop around, so that it makes sense. And this is also important because I remember when when I was working for the Sutherland Institute back in 2007, and we estimated what would be the market for free market education with a voucher system they wanted to introduce there. And one of the things that came up was how do education entrepreneurs know that they're going to be able to get enough revenue to stay on the market, to want to make the investment. It wasn't a huge issue, but it is an issue that comes up. So we have to make sure that we have consumers, that we have buying power on the market. Educate the public to be empowered consumers. This is what we should do here, for example, at Wyoming Liberty Group or other groups who work for free market reforms, for more freedom, more economic freedom especially. And this is something that is sometimes also forgotten. We have to create a legislative firewall against growth of government so that 5 years, 10 years down the road, you don't have a resurrection of government. When I was a kid, the last remains of many free markets in Sweden went away, and I remember how the newspapers and TV news were full with complaints from entrepreneurs who'd been simply had their market taken away by government, how they were going into place after place to replace them. That could happen again. If we do successful reforms, there could be a resurrection of pro-government movements that could win the legislature and then re-socialize what we have privatized. So I'm just throwing this out there. I know there is no member of the legal team here, but a question that I'm asking, and I'm not giving any answers to, because I'm by no means at all a constitutional, I have no insight into constitutional issues, but my question is, do we need a constitutional protection of economic freedom? Do we need some sort of amendment that protects economic freedom as it is? I have no idea. That's something I would like to ask a constitutional scholar at some point to see if it's even practical. Again, in order for us to succeed with reforms, we have to secure competition, secure purchasing power, empower consumers, give them the courage to go out and be consumers, and we have to create some kind of legislative protection of the free market. We have to strengthen that so that it doesn't happen again. One reason why this is so important down here is also that we're seeing a slow but steady growth of the welfare state here in the United States in a way that I think a lot of people don't realize. If you look at how the federal money going into state budgets, how that is spent and what it is for, we can see a steady increase in the welfare state, European-style welfare state. So it's very easy. It's very easy to resurrect government. There are many ways to do that for those who are so inclined. But that was my little presentation, and I guess I leave the floor open to you guys.
Bob, did you say
I guess three things. You started out by saying in order to have freedom and prosperity, the private sector has to grow. Nothing can grow forever. Why does it have to continue growing? Why can't there be a steady state in which the private sector produces the things that the people need and want? And there's in a lot of local and state politicians, there's embedded this idea that you have to have growth. And you know, I question that. Why isn't Cheyenne big enough? Why does Cheyenne have to keep growing? So that's well.
Let's start with that question. Yes, you can have growth infinitely. It doesn't necessarily mean that you occupy more land for housing. That's not necessarily what it means. If you look at growth, economic growth over the past half century, it's been in the form of higher quality services to a very large extent. If you look at growth, for example, in the production of healthcare, it's shifted from machines to another type of technology, such as, for example, medical drugs. Growth, we consume a lot more services today than we did 30, 40 years ago. And that has raised our standard of living tremendously. We have our standard consumer products today are infinitely more capable and of higher quality than they were if you go back half a century. That is growth. That represents growth itself. So yes, we can have growth infinitely. And I am a strong proponent of growth, because growth gives people the chance to improve their lives, make more money, grow their businesses. Stagnation is the worst thing that can happen. That's what they have in Europe today, and we've had that here in the U.S. During the recession. It has not been very fun. Stagnation in Europe today means that you have 20 countries where youth unemployment is 20% or higher. Stagnation means that your kids grow up to live a less prosperous life than you live. And I don't want that to happen by any means at all. On the contrary, we need growth. Why don't we take the next question, and we'll get back to you later so we get more people in on the floor.
This is just off the top of my head response to the last deal, the last statement you had up there about constitutional needs on economics and
a constitutional protection of economic freedom.
Right. Personally, I would say yes, because if you didn't want government to regulate it, you would need this is just my own opinion, you would need a statute or something in the founding documents, I think, saying you can have all the economic growth you want up to a point. Because if we didn't have that, you would see a repeat of the early, late 1890s, early 1900s, when Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and those people tried to control the oil industry, the banking industry, and finally, if memory serves me right, I believe government had to step in and say enough.
Yeah, the antitrust laws. You're pointing to something that is actually one of the more compelling challenges for economists with a free market preference. Every single individual entrepreneur wants to be a monopolist, because that is then he will totally dominate the market and he can make the maximum of money with a minimum of input. Every single consumer and citizen wants free competition. And there is entrepreneurs who are being pushed aside by the growing sort of aspiring monopolies. They also want free competition. So there is a tension here in the capitalist system itself. But that is one of the dynamic forces that keeps the system alive. Whether or not we need antitrust laws, it's a double-edged sword. And I used to be for them entirely. I'm not so sure anymore. But you're raising a compelling question. And again, when I throw out this with a constitutional amendment for economic freedom, it's just for debate. I don't know whether it's possible or even desirable, but I think it's time to discuss the question, because there are so many other issues that are being brought up from a constitutional viewpoint where people have opinions. Why not just throw this one into the mix?
A lot of the stuff you've talked about is really good, and it's good for people. It's good for for a nation and its inhabitants. When you have tyrannical government that comes in like we have and have had for, I don't know, let's just put a number on it, like the last 50 years, and they just trounce the Constitution, they do what they want to, big money, it isn't going to make any difference what kind of constitutional protections you put in there and all this other stuff until we figure out how to bury the existing, dictators, tyrannical type people that are running our government. So I don't know, somehow we have to do that first, or what we're doing here in this room and what you're proposing will have absolutely no chance to survive or no meaning. That sounds to me like something that we really need to do. And maybe through some of the stuff you're proposing, we can, I don't know, push them out, but it doesn't seem likely. You know? That's
the only comment I have really is that I would be careful with using words like tyranny here in the United States. I walked along the east side of the Berlin Wall back in the 80s. I'll leave it at that.
The protections you listed, the last comment for debate, constitutional amendment for economic freedom, that already is inherent in both the articles and the amendments in several places, and also in the Declaration of Independence, where you have life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. When you go back to the debates and the foundation of that statement, it also included the right to use, keep, and own property. That is the basis for economic freedom. And just one more brief point. The point about reforming education. If you're going to pick one thing that turns us around, that will fix this thing with the minimum amount of chaos if it's done right, is reforming education along the lines that you've proposed. The reason we are here is because the Prussian education system, introduced at the beginning of the 19th century and hit the ground running at the beginning of the 20th century, has slowly, methodically moved true classic education off the scene in our country. And then finally, at an accelerated pace in the 60s and beyond, knowledge of American history, how it relates to world history, how our Constitution was formed and why, how our nation was formed and why. Those things are gone. So we have 2 or 3, if you take 10 years as a generation, or 12 years, which is a K through 12 generation. We've had several of those since the 60s who have no concept of the founding, nurturing development of this country. Without that knowledge, people have no reason to change until it's too late. Until it's too late, until the socialist machine has them trapped and they're in a hand-to-mouth situation, which is where we're headed. So you're right on, and thank you.
Thank you. I think it goes hand in hand with some of the things you said. No, yes, you. That with the exception for the comment about the tyrants, I think what you were getting at was that if you have people in power who disrespect the Constitution, the only next remedy is for informed citizens to step in. Did I get you right?
Yeah. It just, in our system, when Barack Obama's in 2007, when he was running for president, he said, "When I am president, no one will tell me what to do." Was he talking about the Senate? Was he talking about, the judicial? Was he talking about the people? I thought he was elected to work for us. And that's exactly what he's done since he came in. He said, "No one will tell me what to do." So if that's not tyrannical, and maybe you don't like that word, you don't like it on the microphone, but I don't know how else to put it when you have people like him doing what he's doing. Our Senate, he's making laws. He has no right to make laws. He's doing all kinds of things, and it's not just him. It's the people that have led him, let him get away with it and led up to where he can be where he is today. And, we live in a country today that is not near as free as you might think it is. That's my comment.
Yeah.
We do have restraints on the federal government. It's Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It gives the powers of Congress. James Madison said that the powers of Congress are few and well-defined. Problem we have is the crooks and or mental midgets in Washington don't follow it. That's the other thing to read also is Not Yours to Give by Davy Crockett. Interesting article. Take a time to read it. It's worse than that. Look at anything in the federal government spending. See if you could find it in Article 1, Section 8. 90% or better what the Congress does, what government does, is not authorized by the Constitution. And then some people are saying, well, we need a balanced budget amendment. Why would they follow an additional amendment when they don't follow the Constitution now? And suppose the budget's not balanced. Is the Supreme Court going to order a tax increase? Yeah. The Congress and the Senate are derelict in their duties. They should have had articles of impeachment on Barry Soweto a long time ago.
Interestingly, I don't know how many of you have read the Constitution of the Confederate States. Their Commerce Clause actually forbids use of government money for anything except national defense and infrastructure. Explicitly says that. I thought it was interesting that they did it, and that's a while ago that they thought they had to make that change. But very interesting comments. I mean, that's why I myself don't know where I stand honestly on a constitutional amendment. But I think it's. I mean, if we don't have the Constitution, what else do we have? Well, we have educated citizens. Next question.
I agree. If we followed these steps, we could shrink government. But if someone proposes, for example, that we're going to adopt a policy that parents are responsible for feeding their own children, that person would be portrayed in the media as a wild-eyed radical. We have to have school lunch programs and all that. So I don't know as a practical matter how you get started. Entitlements is a very broad term. And when I think of entitlements, I think of three things. I think of programs like Social Security and Medicare, where you can't really avoid them. If you're going to work, you have to pay into them, and you pay into them with the understanding that at some point you're going to get benefits out. The second category would be what I call welfare programs, where there is no forced enrollment into the programs. You get benefits out, but you don't have to pay explicitly in. And then the third category would be things that you're entitled to just by virtue of existing, such as a K through 12 education. So I guess the two questions are, as a practical matter, I guess what it comes down to is you have to elect better representatives, but that doesn't seem to be working. Are there any practical steps that can be taken other than generalized education to proceed, and in what order would you address removing these entitlements?
Very important questions. Did you want to comment on that, Susan?
Well, I think it's a matter of gumption. When I look at Sven's list, it still seems a bit socialistic to me, Sven. One of the things that I think we need to push the boundaries of the freedoms that we have. We need to push the boundaries of free speech. We're bringing a suit before the city council that limits yard signs, for instance. And there's a spring in the step of the legal team. They love doing it. We're bringing in before the legislature. We're getting somebody to sponsor multi-family homeschooling. That I don't think there's a lack of entrepreneurial energy. And coming from an entrepreneurial family, I kind of take umbrage at the fact that we want a monopoly on something. It's too much fun. There's too much fun in the competition. We want to be the best at what we do and have our share of the market, but it's a continual race, and I think as long as there's a dream, as long as people aspire to something that's better, you're not going to just stay. You are going to grow in quality and in happiness too. So I honor you, Sven, for your thoughts on your presentation, but I don't necessarily fall in line with all of your suggestions right along. I think that there's a lot of I think there's a lot of gumption in people, and especially in this group. And that was a speech, not a question. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm glad to hear that a plan that would completely remove government from any and every entitlement is called a little bit too socialistic. That gives me hope, because that means that I'm behind the curve, not ahead of it, and I'm glad to hear that. Now, what programs do we start with, and where, and how? I would say, long story short, all over the board. There are a lot of government programs that we can do away with tomorrow, like Maureen's work on fish and game, for example. Look at that. You could just terminate, there are many programs that you could terminate overnight. Then there are some programs that are going to take a long time to get rid of, like Social Security. In my book, Ending the Welfare State, A Path to Limited Government That Won't Leave the Poor Behind, I have a plan. I've developed a plan. I actually developed it for, if you remember, the late Craig Thomas, senator, Wyoming senator. It was actually at his request I developed it originally. This is back in 2006. That plan would take 40 years to completely get rid of government if you want to do it in a way that you get the Democrats on board. You can probably do it a whole lot faster if you want to. There are these steps to get rid of public education, I don't know, 5 years? It all depends on how long the legislative process is. The reform process that actually creates or restores a free market doesn't have to be that long. But we also have to keep in mind that there are so few examples of comprehensive reform to terminate government available that if we want a time frame right here and now before we start, we're not going to be able to build that. We don't have enough examples. So let's say, like JFK said, let us begin. It doesn't matter if it takes 1 year or 10 years or 15 years. The very fact that we get started is the important part. The income security entitlements are the toughest ones to reform away. There is no doubt about that. And I would say that Medicare is a lot easier to deal with because of what it entitles people to. The major, if you want to get into the technical problems, the major macro hurdle you have is that the people who pay the brunt of the taxes are not the ones who get the entitlements. And you can run into a problem there with getting the first two steps to sync. It is possible to do it. But that could be one of the challenges where you have to really craft your reforms.
Let's go back to Susan's point about the multifamily homeschooling. Homeschooling is an area where I am very, very impressed with what I saw in those homeschoolers who wound up at the University of Wyoming that I actually could track when I was on the board. They were the best prepared, and most of them weren't on like a trustee scholarship or some scholarship that comes through the system because they weren't in the system. But they were setting the pace as far as being on the dean's list. So I think that is an area where you can go, and I think the voucher system allows us to transition to that and not cause great chaos. The competition between that system and what looks like a public school system will, by attrition, take care of getting rid of the public school system without legislation, without rock throwing or name calling. The free market, and then I'm going to transition a little bit because that's a free market thing that I believe in, and I am a free marketeer. It's benefited me in my life, from a barefoot farm boy in Louisiana to now I have a pair of shoes. So when we worry about the J.P. Morgan era, we have at least now in our society enough general education and enough specialists, enough people to create competition where nobody is going to have a monopoly. Nobody. Even the geniuses like Gates and the Apple guy, they led the pack, but hot on their heels were more than I can name, and some of them have been consolidated. So there's going to be competition. So I'm not worried about a monopoly, especially in education, because the homeschoolers have established a standard in their individual homes and in their groups that will prevent that. And if they had the resources of vouchers, look out.
To address the monopoly issue, I just have one philosophical statement. A monopoly can't exist unless the business that has that quote-unquote monopoly gets the legislative support of the government to support that business, because the capitalist system is designed around creative destruction. And that's why Bill Gates, if Bill Gates did not have the government come in and enforce a monopolistic, we're going to have Office as a standard, then you come up with Open Office, which is a freeware program that can undermine it. Steve Jobs comes and does his stuff. Google does their stuff. The reason that those monopolies start to exist, just like they did in the railroad, in the quote-unquote robber barons, is because they were in bed with the government establishing land rights that gave them the right to do that and gave them the monopoly. If a group of people like we are sitting here could gather up $1 million and say, let's start a software company, and I know people that have done it, you can take it and turn it into a $100 million company. What you end up fighting is the tax breaks and all the rest of the stuff that are geared towards the large corporations that have paid the lobbyist to pass the rules because it makes financial business sense. Their return on their investment of paying a lobbyist is there. That's why it exists.
But let me ask you, just out of curiosity, since this is coming up, it takes, what is it, between 7 and 11 years to develop new pharmaceutical drugs. That's an enormous investment that those companies make.
Billions of dollars.
And they have a protection from somebody else coming in and starting to produce that without having made that investment. Do you, is that an appropriate government protection of that company or not?
That's a protection of an intellectual property, but it doesn't give them... It's a protection of an intellectual property, much like if you come up with a plan and you have the intellectual right to your book, for example. But there's a difference if you turn around and lobby and say, hey, listen, I'm going to outlaw another company from independently deriving a drug that accomplishes a comparable thing. Okay? So if my drug is a statin drug to lower cholesterol, and I can go back and say, cholesterol-lowering drugs only can comply with this structure, this chemical structure, of which I own the patent. Okay? Now what I've done is I've effectively isolated anybody else from coming up, creatively coming up with a different way, a different chemical composition that could do that. So there's a difference between protecting intellectual rights, and I agree with you. Now what that time period is, that's up for discussion, because what was legitimate for a manufacturing process in the 1800s is very different now. It's just accelerating a lot quicker. But there's a difference between that and isolating, okay, and a banking company, and I can tell you some stuff from my familiarity with J.P. Morgan Chase, what they've done. You backdoor some stuff and you basically create legislation that protects a small community bank from doing things that you, as a large corporation bank, have the ability to do because of your assets, your asset levels. And what you're doing is essentially isolating competition, squashing it before it starts.
One comment on the matter of the monopoly. Microsoft's biggest product is Windows, and there's a perfectly viable alternative to Windows. It's a version of Unix called Linux. And interestingly enough, that is produced and maintained and updated by people who aren't even paid to do it. They do it because of the fun and the excitement of being productive.
There's one other thing no one touched on so far, a phony money supply. Take a look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. Congress is authorized to control currency. I can't find any place in the Constitution where it says they can give that power away to an unelected group that meets in secret. That's what we have with the Federal Reserve Board. Best way to fight this, if you're ever on in a trial for counterfeiting, you're on a jury. You have to vote to acquit. They didn't copy U.S. currency. They copied Federal Reserve notes. So if anything, it's copyright infringement or fraud. It's not counterfeiting. By the way, last year was the 100th anniversary of the Year of Infamy, to borrow a phrase from Joe Stalin's best friend, FDR. It gave us the creature from Jekyll Island, better known as the Federal Reserve Board. Also gave us the 16th Amendment. How many people realize there's two parts to the 16th Amendment? Everybody mentions income tax, but it forgets the second clause that voided Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. Prior to that, Congress had to give out money according to the population of the various states. They couldn't say, Congress, a senator couldn't go in there, I want $100 million to build a port. And the other thing we had was the 17th Amendment. That turned us from a republic to a democracy.
Can we have one more question?
I want to thank you for your presentation, and I'm glad to hear other people say we need to privatize a lot more, because there is so much government entitlements. But what can we do on a local level here in Cheyenne? Is there a baby step so that people can start seeing success? I mean, because we're not going to be able to change public education for a while, but if there's something locally that we can actually start doing, I was wondering if you guys have some ideas of where you're going to start and where you need soldiers to change some of these local entitlements.
What I've talked about here, I focus primarily on the state level, because that's where the local governments in Wyoming depend heavily on the state for money. They get more than a third of their funds from the state. The state has a lot more clout when it comes to being a sovereign entity in terms of fiscal policy. The way to start there is to reform us out of our dependency on federal funds, because with them come a lot of ties that create a lot of government spending and put us on a lot of autopilot on the state budget, if you will. So that's what, when it comes to what I'm talking about specifically, that's where you can start. But that doesn't mean there aren't things to do at the local level. Education is probably something you'll have to fight at the state level. But I know that, as Susan mentioned, our legal team is involved in things locally as well. And the more people we get on board who have their own little issues to work with, the better, because then our movement is sprawling. So in a matter of speaking, what we do here is we're freedom multipliers in a way, and I'll be happy to talk to you. I know all the members of our staff will be happy to talk to you about what you can do and how you can get involved. Can I say one very brief, one last thing? What I talk about here, it's just like so many other things. This is a suggestion for how to go about it. If you come up with an even better plan, by all means, follow it. But I think it is, what I wanted to show you here is that it's not hard. It's not rocket science to roll back government. It's very easy. We have to get it right. We have to make sure that we plan well and that we know that we have a good shot of getting where we want to get. But we can all do this, especially if we work together.
Thank you very much, John. Where there's a will, there's a way. And thank you very much for coming. Please stay, enjoy some refreshments and some conversation.